This is your reality check. Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is June 8th, 2020. I'm Christina Roach, and with me is producer Pat.
Hi, everybody.
As has been the case for several weeks now, Darren and Adam continue to record solo in isolation. But that doesn't stop us. We have 3 really interesting segments for you today. Adam brings a little levity and looks into whether Han Solo and Luke Skywalker are human, a very Adam thing to do. Then Pat fact-checks whether the volcano in Yellowstone National Park is due to erupt, quote-unquote, any day now. But first, we throw to Darren, who talks to us about talking about race, police, or really anything.
So, not much going on in the news over the past week, eh? The brutal treatment and death of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis and the resulting protests in many American cities and other countries and many places on Earth has dominated the news. Of course, many people have opinions on what's going on, and many people have opinions on those opinions. And just so you know, this was recorded at the beginning of June, and I think it's likely going to hold even if something becomes far more severe. As such, I thought it might be useful to talk about talking about different complex issues like race and policing, but I think what I'll say is applicable to many topics and situations. Now, this is not a segment where I'm providing scientific evidence to support various hypotheses, but more of an exploration about how we might communicate about difficult topics and things to keep in mind when we try to do so. Some of the main themes I want to cover are 1. The ability to simultaneously believe multiple things that are often presented as exclusionary. 2. Why one communicates anything. Really, why do anything? 3. Who the intended audience is. 4. The importance of an issue. And 5. Disproportionate influence by small groups of people. Number 1. Believing many things at the same time. Several days ago on Facebook, I shared an image of 4 overlapping circles, a Venn diagram of sorts, with each circle having a statement which I'll describe now. In the top left, it said, George Floyd's death was murder and the cops responsible should be in jail. The top right said, the police system is structurally corrupt and regularly refuses to prosecute cops. The bottom left said, mass protests and civic disruptions are legitimate and warranted actions. And the bottom right said, looting and burning businesses is immoral and counterproductive. People who do this should go to jail. In the middle, in the intersection of these 4 circles, in larger font, are the words, you can be here, meaning you can believe all 4 of these things at the same time. When I introduced the image, I said false dichotomies are bad, and false quadcotomies, they're worse. Of course, it is true that some people only have one of these beliefs, and if they have that belief, they don't believe the 3 other things. Well, sometimes that's how it goes in the world. Our mental bandwidth is limited, and we use heuristics to understand the world. But that doesn't mean we should assume people hold beliefs that they might not have, because that makes any communication we have more difficult. Humans certainly love to put people in boxes and draw lines between the in-group and the out-group, but that doesn't mean it's true or constructive. That said, I can definitely see how hard it is to not fully rely on past experience, and I offer empathy. Many black people in the United States and elsewhere in the world have had to deal with all sorts of stupidity and vitriol from people that didn't like, for example, Colin Kaepernick silently, calmly, peacefully protesting. And that's just one instance of such negative experiences. So if someone starts with complaining about looting, it would be hard not to assume that they only care about looting and don't believe those other 3 things. Probably one of those people who didn't like Kaepernick peacefully protesting. But what to do? Are these people going to change their mind? Should you even talk to them in the first place? Well, this relates to the next point on the goal of communication, but for now I'll say the main takeaway is to be careful of the assumptions you may be making about the people you're talking to. And just as a personal example, when I posted this, someone was critical of this Venn diagram, and they've like, how can you not take a principled stand? Like, how can you not? Things are complicated. And only after several comments did they realize they misread the Venn diagram. And they thought the person was arguing against most of these things as opposed to believing all 4 of them. They're like, oh, that's actually the great diagram. So even if something's great and someone thinks it's great, they may not see it the first time. Communication. Number 2, why communicate anything? This may seem easy to answer, but it isn't always the case, both for ourselves and others. Are we asking a question that we want to know the answer to? Are we frustrated and making a statement of catharsis or anger? Are we looking for feedback, or conversely, are we not looking for any sort of feedback? Are we signaling to our tribe that we are part of our tribe? Is there some goal of solidarity? And so on and so on. Now, here at the show, we tend to evaluate claims to see if they're supported by evidence and reasoning. It's also what I tend to do in my personal life, or normal life, or anytime. When anyone is speaking, including myself, I often have a cognitive subroutine asking, is that true? Does that make sense? Now, I understand others do not always do this, nor do they want to have that particular discussion. That's why I'm not invited back to parties. But recently, someone on Facebook posted some words, and it also had the phrase, all cops are murderers, every single one of them. I happened to comment. I can understand why they're frustrated and upset, but that's clearly not true. In hindsight, I shouldn't have made the comment. Not because they were correct and I was wrong, clearly that statement is false and preposterous, but because they were angry and frustrated and voicing that anger and frustration, and their words were not intended for actual purposes of discussion. In this case, I probably should have known better and just said nothing, or just offered support and perhaps discussed the issue of the validity of the statement at a different time, if at all. Main takeaway here is the conversation you want to have may not be the same as the conversation the other person wants to have. If you aren't sure, try asking them. For example, are you open to having a conversation about X? May be a decent start. Number 3, who is your audience? What assumptions have you made about your audience? Are you trying to give more attention to an aspect of an issue that you believe is getting relatively less attention? Does this actually work in the real world because different people have different beliefs about what's getting more or less attention and they're trying to balance things out differently than you are? Probably. Are you focusing on the area of disagreement but not sufficiently highlighting the area of agreement? This one is further complicated by discussions in the public or semi-public sphere on social media, where you may not know people who are commenting and they don't know you, which links back to the first post about trying not to assume the beliefs people have. Now, in my peer group, I would say 99% of people think what happened to George Floyd is terrible, shouldn't have happened, and shouldn't happen again. And I guess some part of my brain thinks, well, since we all agree, this issue doesn't get as much attention as something else, like looting, because it seems like there is actually some disagreement about that particular issue. Now, from the outside, it may look as if I care more about the response, the looting, than the incident, but that's not true. I don't know much about the US policing system, but I did post some supposed evidence-based actions to perform it. But beyond that, I'm not sure what else to do. I could repost it. I could offer general words of solidarity, but I don't see much action take as a Canadian impacting the US police system in a different state. What about the Canadian police system? Well, I should educate myself about that more for sure. But at this moment, I already know more about looting that it doesn't seem to help anyone, but the looter that gets away with 3 things. Perhaps it's a topic on its own for a future show, but as far as I understand it, looting appears to just hurt the local community and cause businesses to leave the area, while its role in provoking systemic change is not at all clear. And going even a bit more meta, for this podcast, we generally assume listeners have a similar worldview. But given we have listeners all over the world, they clearly don't have the same knowledge or lived experiences. As such, we try to provide sufficient context in our segments, but we can never quite know what you already know, where you're coming from, what you think should get more or less attention because of the peer group you inhabit. And as you can see, people might have the same overall idea that X is more important than Y, but they're in an environment where might be getting more or less attention than your environment where X is getting more or less attention. So then when you're talking more about X, they think you don't need to. You need to talk about Y. You're like, but in my world, Y is not getting enough attention. As you can see, that's only with 2 people. So it gets very, very complicated quite quickly. Main takeaway for this one is to think about who your audience might be and realize you may not know each other, which is going to lead to confusions and complications. Number 4, even choosing a topic indicates something is worth talking about more than something else. It is tempting to see this as completely true, but the world is actually more nuanced than that, and context does matter. The effective altruism framework, which you may have heard me talk about, for selecting a cause usually focuses on how people are affected, whether they can be helped, and whether the area is neglected. So you often hear me discuss about malaria and anti-malarial bed nets. But in terms of the worst thing one could experience, in my opinion, it is probably something like sexual slavery. I've rarely, if ever, mentioned that on the show, but that doesn't mean I don't believe it to be true. But this isn't a weekly podcast about the horrors of sexual slavery. I don't know if I'd want to present that segment every week, and you probably don't want to hear about it every week. So we cover a wide range of controversies and curiosities. The end result of the show is a mix of our interests, what's in the news, and perhaps the impact of various segments. So how does this relate to communications? On some level, someone thinks if you're talking about it, you think something is important, and if you're not talking about something else, that might make them think it's not important. Is that true? Again, as a heuristic, it might be, but in detail, it might not be. It is also interesting, and often frustrating, about how people group categories and contrast them. Say you have a post about one social issue. People might ask why you aren't posting about a different social issue. But they aren't going to make that comment on a silly cat meme. It's just clear, like, well, why aren't you posting a dog meme? Like, that's just not how people think. But in other domains, they do think that way. Of course, the intentions of a social issue post and a cat meme are completely different, but they both take up attentional resources, so why is this not the right thing to do? One must be careful not to slip towards extremism, which is likely less effective. The main takeaway for this is that there are many reasons people discuss topic X over topic Y, often driven by whatever pops up in their social circle and newsfeed, not driven by an objective analysis of what matters most, perhaps even to them upon reflection. People can often care about more than one thing, which then goes back to that first and third points that I talked about. Number 5. And just a reminder to be careful about understanding the disproportionate influence by small numbers of people. This happens in politics, well, perhaps in almost any issue anywhere. And I think it's most clearly evident when lazy journalists report about a few people on Twitter complaining about something. 8 people disliking a movie isn't news. Can we just stop pretending it is? Imagine just going into the street and listening to some random person shout out things. This sucks. You're like, let me write that down. That's now journalism. Not all journalists, of course, but that's how when people quote Twitter, that's what I think they're mostly doing. The main reason to keep this in mind is that you don't generalize and stereotype a larger group from a few examples, especially across various domains. I think this is true for any population, and that probably includes protesters as well as police. And there's a lot in there too, that could probably be more for a future segment. So in summation, if you're trying to improve the communicative world you inhabit, try to keep the following main issues in mind. 1. People can simultaneously believe multiple things that are often presented as exclusionary. 2. Think about why you and others are communicating. 3. Think about who your intended audience is and realize you may not know each other or be reaching that particular intended audience. 4. Why you speak about certain issues and not others. Think about that. Are these the things you really want to talk about? And 5. Disproportionate influence by small groups of people can cause confusion when trying to understand larger patterns. I hope that improves your communications. Good luck, and until next time, think better to act better.
Thanks, Darren. All right, Pat, what's going on with Yellowstone National Park?
So several memes have been going around the internet about things that have happened this year. They change things up, but the general idea is an image of a calendar with something like January, World War III, referring to the January 3rd U.S. strike against the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani. Hours after the Pentagon announced his death, World War III was trending on Twitter. February, Australia is on fire.
Yeah.
This refers to the devastating bushfires across that country where 27 million acres burned and at least 33 people died. March, well, coronavirus.
Yeah.
April, UFO videos released by the U.S. government. This referring to the Pentagon officially releasing 3 short videos showing unidentified aerial phenomena. May, mass protests sparked by the death of George Floyd. I won't get into fact-checking those dates, but let's just say some liberties were taken for the sake of making the timeline fit. One thing some of these memes suggest for June, though, is an eruption in Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is America's first national park. It's really big, larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined.
Wow.
It is probably best known for Old Faithful, a geyser named for its somewhat predictable eruptions. It has erupted more than 1 million times since 1872 when Yellowstone became a national park.
Did you say 1 million?
Yes, I did.
Wow.
While Old Faithful is the world's most famous geyser, Yellowstone is home to more than 500 active geysers, which is more than half the world's geysers. I may actually do a segment on Old Faithful at some point. How they predict the next eruption is pretty interesting stuff. But the point regarding the meme I was talking about is that Yellowstone is the site of a supervolcano that sits below the Earth's crust. The term supervolcano means that it has had an eruption of magnitude 8 on the volcanic explosivity index, spewing more than 1,000 cubic kilometers or 240 cubic miles of material. If the Yellowstone volcano were to have a massive eruption, it could blast ash for thousands of miles, damage buildings, smothering crops, shutting down power plants. It would just be really bad news. So the idea that this is imminent seems to be fueled by 2 claims. First, that nearly 300 earthquakes were centered in Yellowstone National Park in the month of May 2020. And second, Yellowstone is overdue for an eruption. But are these things true? So during the month of May 2020, the University of Utah seismograph stations responsible for the operations and analysis of Yellowstone's seismic network located 288 earthquakes. The largest event was an earthquake of magnitude 3.1. So that first part is true. 300 sounds like a lot of earthquakes, and it certainly backs up the idea that the park is geologically active. But Yellowstone averages 1,500 to 2,000 earthquakes per year. Looking at the data from the last decade, the average is 4.7 earthquakes per day, or about 1 earthquake every 5 hours. They are not evenly distributed over time, though, because about half of these events occur in what are called swarms. And that's what happened in May of this year. In fact, there were 3 swarms of earthquakes.
So what exactly is a swarm?
So swarm, I guess, is like a cluster of earthquakes that are close in time and space.
Okay.
So 300 is a lot, but it's not that unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the second part. You probably heard that Yellowstone is overdue. It goes something like this, that the supervolcano has a major eruption every 600,000 years on average. And since the last eruption was 631,000 years ago, well, you get the idea. Is this part true? From a recent article on this by Michael Poland, scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, posted to the U.S. Geological Survey's site, quote, in a word, no. In 2 words, no way. In 3 words, not even close. In terms of large explosions, Yellowstone has experienced 3 at 2.08, 1.3, and 0.631 million years ago. This comes out to an average of about 725,000 years between eruptions. That being the case, we still have 100,000 years to go. But this number is based on very little data, and so it's meaningless. Again, from the article from the U.S. Geological Survey site, if someone or some article says that Yellowstone erupts every 600,000 years, you know right off the bat that they're full of baloney. And even if we had more data to average out, when super eruptions occur more than once in the same volcanic system, which is not the norm, they aren't evenly spaced in time. While another catastrophic eruption at Yellowstone is possible, scientists are not convinced that one will even happen. The magma chamber beneath the park is only 5 to 15% molten, so it's unclear if there's even enough magma to feed a large eruption.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. If it does erupt again, it doesn't mean it will be some large catastrophic event. The most recent volcanic eruption at Yellowstone was a lava flow that occurred 70,000 years ago. So while 2020 has been pretty rough so far, none of the actual facts point to an imminent threat of eruption for the Yellowstone supervolcano, and nothing supports the idea that one is overdue. There you have it.
Wow, I kept seeing that to the point that I believed without further investigation, just on the surface of all the reporting, that this was true. And we really don't need anything else to worry about in 2020. So it's great that you dug into that.
It's funny, I had a little back and forth with Dr. Stuart Robbins about this, just mentioning that I was doing this segment. And what he said was, it's a fallacy of statistics to use any sort of long-term average and say we are due or not due for something.
And with that, we leave you with Adam looking into whether Han Solo and Luke Skywalker are human. Stay classy, stay safe.
We'll talk to you soon, everyone.
What's up, Cuboids? Thank you, Darren. You made some good points in that segment. Like a lot of people, I'm pretty furious about George Floyd's killing. As a Canadian, this isn't an issue which affects me as directly as my American friends and many of our listeners. Former President Barack Obama wrote a great piece in Medium on the topic, which I suggest you check out if you haven't already, to get a better take than I could be giving you at this time. I certainly have thoughts on the issue, some of which could be considered in scope for the show, but I'll save those for a later time. To anyone who's involved in the protests across the country, please be careful and be safe. I'm recording this on June 3rd, and I don't know how things will be by the time you're listening to this show, but they're pretty bad right now. To anyone working in law enforcement, security, or military who find themselves facing protesters, peaceful or otherwise, I hope that you take a moment to reflect on why you chose to do what you're doing. Property is important, but nothing is more important than protecting the safety, lives, and livelihood of your fellow American citizens, even those who might not have anything good to say about you or your colleagues these days. Now, Darren made an important point about the topics which are worth talking about, and I frequently focus on topics which are or aren't related to whatever terrible thing may be going on in the world right now. I think it's important to tackle important issues, and also to take time to enjoy and distract oneself from these same things. I also think it is generally worthwhile to apply logic and evidence-based reasoning to a variety of topics so that we think that way in all aspects of one's life. With that in mind, I'd like to talk about Star Wars. Now, a while back, Darren sent me this article as a segment idea that he thought was suited to me. Let's just say Darren isn't only right about thinking better to act better. The article was on the website TIMOS, it's a German website. It was about Luke and the Tauntaun with the subtitle, Movie Physics Taken Seriously. Seriously. That's my style. The premise is in the film The Empire Strikes Back, which is the second film in the Star Wars saga, which has a number 5 attached to it because, well, that's not what my segment's about, but that's because Star Wars is special. Luke Skywalker, the protagonist in the films, well, in this film at least, is lost on an ice planet. Han Solo, who is not a Jedi, wields Luke's lightsaber to slice open Luke's mount, a tauntaun, which is a kind of cross between a kangaroo and an ostrich. He puts Luke inside so that he won't freeze, basically insulated by this creature. Now, this was not Han's last encounter with a lightsaber. The article sets out with some assumptions, and I quote, "We have to make some very basic assumptions here. For instance, we assume that Luke and Han are humans, or at least life forms that are, in the properties relevant to our calculations, pretty similar to humans. Therefore, we know the core body temperature of these characters. In Luke's case, we can assume it to be 37 degrees Celsius. That means for the time being, he's not undercooled yet, just exhausted." And frankly, this is where the article lost me on the first assumption, because that's how too seriously I take science in movies. This one isn't physics, but biology, but it's the same idea. So let's instead ask ourselves a simple question. Are Luke Skywalker and Han Solo human? Now, full confession, I'm not that well versed in the so-called expanded universe of Star Wars, be it the stuff that's currently canon like the new TV shows or the Legends stuff, the old expanded universe. But I've watched the movies more times than a person should normally watch pretty much any movie. No, I don't think it is fair to assume that Luke Skywalker or Han Solo are humans. Star Wars takes place, and I quote from the opening crawl of the first film, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. How long ago? Who knows? We're talking about galaxies away, so it could literally be hundreds of millions or billions of years. It's probably not like 6 years, but even then, Star Wars came out in 1977, and humans went to the moon in 1969, so it's very unlikely that humans who evolved on Earth made it to another galaxy far, far away, a long time ago, where there appear to have been people for many, many years. So how far is far, far away? Well, it's probably not like the next galaxy over, that would be Andromeda, because I don't say my neighbor's house is a house that's far, far away, even if a house is far by some standards. Sure, even the closest galaxy is really, really far away. That's 2.5 million light years, or 770 kiloparsecs. Parsecs being a unit of distance, and Solo is one of the worst movies ever made. The galaxy could be outside of our visible universe. So much to say, humans that evolved on Earth could not have been in the Star Wars universe during the events of the films. It seems unlikely, though perhaps more plausible in Star Wars canon, that the humans from the Star Wars galaxy ended up coming to Earth and leading to our own civilization. Star Wars hyperspace travel is faster than the speed of light, and the technology in the films, though somewhat inconsistent, may account for a ship traveling intergalactic distances over a long, long time. If you factor in things like freezing people in carbonite and droids to awaken passengers after long periods of time, this could happen. But that doesn't totally make sense. Of course, we have an impeccable fossil record here which can be traced back to the Precambrian, and we're able to find similar genes throughout all living organisms on Earth. Those genes are shared with us, humans. Outside of the excellent Ewok adventure movies, other Earth species are generally not seen in the Star Wars universe. That said, the surface of Endor sure does look like it has redwoods, and Earth-looking plants are plentiful in the series. But this is what comes with shooting a film on this actual planet. We're not going to other planets to shoot Star Wars movies, not yet. As an example of why Star Wars Expanded Universe stuff can be confusing, let's consider that Endor is the name of the moon around a planet named Endor in a system named Endor, according to official Star Wars canon. Now, we don't even know where the so-called humans in the Star Wars universe evolved. Some sources say Coruscant, the planet-sized city, but this is never stated without ambiguity. So not human, right? Well, it seems the people in Star Wars are called humans in the old Legend Expanded Universe. They are also called humans in a canon source, a Star Wars novel called Rebel Rising about Jyn Erso, the main character in the beautiful-looking but mentally vacuous film Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. So it's a prequel book to a prequel movie. You can tell me a book that I'll never read as canon, but I won't feel it that deeply in my heart. So much to come after The Empire Strikes Back directly contradicts events in the earlier films, so I feel comfortable in disregarding this book. Although people in Star Wars are played by human actors, I don't think we can call them human. Can we assume they are biologically comparable to humans? Probably. They breathe and hold their breath when a poisonous smoke fills the room, or they need a breathing apparatus to go underwater, Episode 1. We see a lot of types of environments in Star Wars, and all of them seem like environments which are comparable to places humans would be able to live here on Earth. Tatooine is a desert planet, but they have moisture farms to gather water from the air, so it's not so hot that there can't be moisture in the atmosphere. Hoth, The planet in question where Luke may or may not freeze to death is an ice planet, but we don't really know how cold it is there. So is it -5 Celsius, a bit cold but not too bad? Or is it like -100 Celsius, where a person from Earth would die almost instantly of exposure? Well, we don't really know. The air is not frozen, but we don't actually know what the air there is made of. We don't know that the people in this galaxy breathe oxygen. The snow seems to be frozen ice, but we don't know that for sure. All things being equal, we can make the default assumption that things are as they seem, and that these people are somewhat comparable to humans. There are a few instances where it's suggested the biology in the Star Wars universe isn't really like ours. Midichlorians come to mind. These are mentioned in The Phantom Menace as being symbiotic microorganisms which live inside a person's body. They can be measured through some sort of blood test, and they dictate how someone can communicate with the Force. Naturally, here on Earth, people are not known to interact with midichlorians, and the Force does not appear to be strong in anybody, though many purveyors of pseudoscience may make claims which would be consistent with those of Force users. But these are separate from human organisms, so one could argue that people in the Star Wars universe are humans who happen to have these inside of them, and people on Earth are humans who do not. So otherwise, do we assume the people in Star Wars to be like humans? Imagine, if you would, that after 6 main Star Wars movies, when Obi-Wan and Anakin are duking it out on Mustafar, the volcanic planet where the final battle in Revenge of the Sith takes place, if Anakin, making the mistake of not having the high ground, ended up completely submerged in a pool of lava. Well, we don't necessarily know that lava would kill him. He's not human. We don't know anything about his vulnerability to heat or cold. A lightsaber chopped off his arm, but that could be a lot hotter than lava. So maybe Anakin swims around in the lava, comes up, swims up on the shore, shakes it all off, spits out a bit of lava on the ground, and then keeps on fighting. The audience would rightfully be a bit put off. These aren't humans, but they're close enough that things in the movie world affect them similarly to how things on Earth would probably affect them. They are aliens, but aliens who are meant to resemble the audience so much that we completely forget that they are any different from us. It's a work of pure fiction, so we accept this as much as we accept that Vulcans, Klingons, and Romulans look like Earth humans wearing cheap prosthetics, because a real alien from another planet might be unrecognizable to us as a person. Without familiar traits, we cannot empathize and relate to these characters as easily as we do. Beyond that, there's a bit of a technical explanation given in Star Trek, which is the idea of convergent evolution or parallel evolution. Convergent evolution is when multiple species develop similar structures or a trait that isn't found in their most recent common ancestor. For example, the eye and winged flight evolved independently many times in many different Earth species. So the idea in Star Trek is that different alien species would evolve similarly. And this means that sometimes even cultures on alien planets will be nearly identical to the Earth of the past, which gives all sorts of weird planets in Star Trek, which seem to be just glimpses of the past or slightly modified presents or futures. This could explain people in Star Wars looking like humans, if that's what George Lucas really intended. It might also be because the humans in Dune look like humans, and George Lucas might have taken a bit of inspiration from that. So it's an interesting idea, and this could possibly be its own segment, this whole idea of convergent and parallel evolution of an alien species. John Abrams looked at the idea on a show ages ago in episode 22 back in 2009, so you can check that out in the show notes on trcpodcast.com. I'm going to discount the ideas put forward in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode The Chase because Ronald Moore is into intelligent design, as is abundantly clear from the ending of the new Battlestar Galactica series. So where am I in all this? Yes, the Tauntaun. Honestly, this was never a segment about the Tauntaun for me. I wanted to question the assumption about people being human in Star Wars and have a little thought about that. The site in question does a lot of math about the amount of heat inside of Luke, his Tauntaun, and what kind of shelter Han is able to build in how much time. It seems like Luke might have been able to survive if the Tauntaun had a thick enough layer of insulating fat. Fat? Why do we assume organisms in a galaxy far, far away have fat? Maybe Jabba's made out of pizza. Who knows? I could go down and do this kind of thing for days. The Mythbusters did a similar analysis and also found that he should have been able to survive. So Luke wouldn't have died in the Tauntaun. Nope, that wasn't my point at all. My point is, there is no reason to assume that the people in the Star Wars universe are human, even though it may be stated as such in some Star Wars expanded universe materials, which are rich with contradictory information. If the stories took place in our future, This assumption would be valid, as the galaxy would be our own, but it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which makes it impossible for the characters to come from Earth because time travel is not part of the Star Wars universe. Still, we treat the characters as human enough, so for argument's sake, we can assume that the Tauntaun math checks out. Makes a lot of sense. Peace out, Cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Time for a drink to be less lip smacky.
Are Luke Skywalker and Son Ho.